We are very, very pleased to have our final session today center around an important topic, what I'd like to call the Maryland model. And our presenter this afternoon, as we thought about organizing this activity, we thought we would have Dr. Clagett as our final speaker. He is Vice President of Planning, Marketing, and Assessment at Carroll Community College. And as I stated this morning, Craig has been extremely helpful in defining success at Maryland's community colleges as we talk about our continued work to serve students and make all of our students as successful as possible. The Maryland Degree Progress Model that Dr. Clagett was instrumental in developing takes into account the unique mission of community colleges as compared to four-year institutions and tracks actual student behavior to create a more complete picture as students move through their college programs, transfer, earn degrees or certificates or other things that we offer them to help meet their educational intentions. All of the community college presidents have been part of Craig's presentation before. I think I speak for the entire group. We're very, very pleased to have him do the work that he's been doing on this with collaboration with others across the state. And I think many of you who will be hearing this presentation, seeing this presentation for the first time, should be very, very pleased. So without further delay, Dr. Craig Clagett.
Thanks. Thank you. Good afternoon. You'll see the subtitle on my talk here is Completion Rates in Context. Perhaps I should have entitled it Completion Rates More Than You Want to Know. Calculating completion rates may seem like a very technical matter. And certainly the course and curriculum innovations that you all talked about in your workshops today are much more important about really helping students succeed in their endeavors. And the more I talk about graduation rates today, I certainly don't mean to downplay at all other parts of our mission, all of the wonderful work we do in workforce development, business training, all the activities through our continuing education offices. Very critical, and obviously any evaluation model of community colleges would have to encompass the complete comprehensive mission of our institutions. But I am going to be talking about graduation rates today because they are important. The perceptions of politicians and the public are influenced by the graduation rates they hear bandied about our institutions. I think we need accurate information to assess the various practices that we were talking about today. And finally, part of our funding may at some point be dependent on these completion rates as Maryland moves towards a performance funding model, which seems to be on the horizon. So to me, these measures and how they're defined does matter. So I'd like to start the story at the beginning. I'm going to step out, see if that mic is still working. Is it working? Very good. Where did all this completion agenda start? It started, in my judgment, back in 1990 with the Student Right to Know Act, otherwise known as SRK. Congress passed this. All institutions that got Title IV funding had to provide graduation rates for a full-time degree-seeking cohort. And they said you had to report completion within 150% of what they called normal time. So they got it wrong right from the beginning, didn't they? Because the number of students that complete within 2 years, statistically, is quite abnormal. Most of our students take 4 or 5 years to complete their degree. So instead of the word normal, they probably should have used in the quickest possible time. But they used the word normal, so we're kind of stuck with that. And this survey was added as the slow progress of many federal agencies. It finally got into the IPEDS collection in 1997, 7 years later. What does the number look like? This is what it looked like for my institution. We had a SRK, or Student Right to Know, graduation rate of about 18%. They also had us report on those students who had not graduated but had transferred, and ours was 14%. So this was the number that we were required to report for a number of years. With the Higher Education Opportunity Act of 2008, they changed this slightly. There were two major things they changed. The first was, now it was mandated that these graduation rates be online, available to the world, on their College Navigator website. So suddenly these numbers were the de facto numbers that everyone would use because they were available on the web. They kept the same definition of the cohort. They did now kick it out and allow us to report outcomes at 200% of normal time, or 4 years for the associate degree. So that was a slight improvement. So what does it look like? If you go on the web this morning or this afternoon, this is what you see. If you go to the IPED State Data Center and you say, what's the graduation rate for Maryland community colleges, this is what will pop up on your screen. You'll notice Maryland at 13.5%, and the website automatically pulls up a regional comparison number and a national number. You'll notice they're higher than ours. So this is the number. If someone is just going online today to look at the completion rate of Maryland community colleges, this is what they see. This is a problem. You want to have any guess as to why we might be half the rate of some of those other comparison numbers? Transfer, there you go. A lot of the two-year institutions across the country are technical institutions that have a lot of career programs. They tend to have higher retention and higher completion rates because they're two-year career-oriented occupational programs. Maryland has a very high percentage of students who are transferring on for the baccalaureate, and that accounts for it. But where is that explanation? Where is that context on the IPED's website? It's not there. If you look up on College Navigator and look for your own institution, this is what you'll see, or this is what you'll see if you look for Carroll's. Normal time, again, using that word, 6% of our students graduate as fast as they possibly can, 2 years. 20% at 150 and 27%, twice as long. So what are the issues with this? Most of these you all are probably pretty familiar with. Excludes part-time students. They're just tracking a full-time cohort. So right away, half of our students or more are not even being considered in this measure. It includes students not seeking the associate degree. Right? We have a lot of these transfer students interested in the baccalaureate. While we advise them and encourage them and want them to stay and complete their associate's degree, they might have a rational reason for transferring prior to that. And they, right now, are not being captured in these graduation rates that the feds collect. What I just made. There's no allowance for developmental education needs for these students. They're tracking them right from their first appearance on our campuses. And we know when we look at the data of our graduates, in fact, the majority of those folks who will, in fact, earn an associate degree from our institution take more than 3 years to do it. So when the feds broadcast this 3-year graduation rate all over creation, they are, in fact, excluding the majority of those folks who will, in fact, complete at our institutions. These measures are time-bound, and the person looking at these numbers on the web doesn't realize all of that. They just look at that number and say, well, that's the completion rate. Well, no, it's the completion rate as of that point in time. And the remainder, unfortunately, are quite often considered failures when we know that not to be the case. So the Maryland Higher Education Commission, with some urging from the colleges, tried to do a little better job than the feds did. And what did they do? They have enrollment and degree information system tapes that we all submit every year as part of our routine state reporting. And there are student IDs on those files that allow us to match those up. So a real plus, and I'll give MACC staff a lot of credit for this, they started a number of years ago to calculate a combined graduation and transfer rate. That's a great improvement over what the federal IPEDS folks were doing. So a lot of kudos to MACC for doing that. Unfortunately, they kept the IPEDS definition of who's to be in this calculation, and we'll talk about that a little more in a moment. And then, of course, the state systems didn't have any way of tracking people who transferred outside of Maryland, which is a problem, since about 1/4 of our transfers leave the state. So what do these numbers look like? Well, for us, you saw my numbers earlier for Carroll, 18 or 14% based on the IPEDS definitions. Now we had a 4-year graduation transfer rate, combined rate, at our institution of 39%. A little better, but still has some issues. So the question that the presidents asked us back in 2004 was, is there a better way to measure completion of degree programs at community colleges in Maryland? So the presidents sent us a charge, there it is, back in March of 2004, to develop a model that incorporated developmental studies and included transfer in this calculation of a completion rate. This is a major move to include a recognition of developmental. In the Performance Accountability Report that the Maryland Higher Education Commission had us turn in back in these days, there was no acknowledgement or awareness that developmental education even existed. So this was actually kind of a radical step when the president said to make sure you explicitly acknowledge and use developmental in your reporting. So this committee met. We did a thorough national literature review of accountability systems in place around the country. We asked the presidents to let us broaden that charge so we could look at things other than graduation rates and include workforce development and other indicators. We developed some draft definitions, shared them with the Maryland Community College Research Group, the IR Affinity Group, did some testing to make sure we could actually provide the data. The institutions had the capability of calculating these rates. And then we vetted it through several of the affinity groups, the academic affairs officers, the student affairs officers, and the continuing education folks during the summer of 2005. So it's quite a long process to develop this. Once we had gotten through all that review, we took it back to the presidents in September. They blessed it. We took it down and had an informal meeting with representatives from the Maryland Higher Education Commission, the Department of Legislative Services, and Department of Budget and Management, state representatives. Met with them in November to get their feeling for our new proposal. They blessed it with some minor changes, and it was formally adopted by the Commission in February of 2006, and our first performance accountability report with this new model was submitted in July of 2006. So that's a little bit of history about where this model came from and how it was developed. It was a long process with a lot of input, and we've been doing it since July of 2006. The most important thing we had to do in developing the model was define the cohort. Who are we going to count when we calculate this completion rate? We obviously wanted to only include those folks who were indeed seeking a degree. So deciding who is a degree-seeking student is not as easy as it sounds. Goal questions are quite problematic. If you ask students about their goals, sometimes they're uncertain about what their goal is. In fact, one of the great things that community colleges do is help people clarify their goals. One of the questions we used to ask on some of our student surveys, and one of the things we asked them to rate, what did you get from your attendance at the college, attending a community college? One of the top answers was, you helped me clarify what my goals were. So students are uncertain about their goals. Their goals may be unrealistic. They may change their goals with experience and advising. Students have to declare themselves degree-seeking in order to access financial aid. A number of the colleges require all students to declare a major for advising purposes, so you get an interest, intent. All of these reasons, you get people classified in degree programs who are not, in fact, seeking degrees. So it's a data integrity problem. So what's the solution? The solution we came up with, and a couple other states were on this track a little before us, was look at student behavior. Don't ask them what their goal is, but look at their behavior and see what their enrollment patterns suggest about whether or not they are degree-seeking students. So what we wanted to do was avoid that unreliable goal question kind of data. We wanted to include part-time students, which the federal definition excluded. But we didn't want to include students who were at the campus for 1 or 2 classes for job skill reasons or personal enrichment. We also wanted to exclude the spring admits at the university. The universities, for a number of reasons, quite often will accept some students for spring admission. They'll tell them not to come in the fall, but we'll admit you in the spring. So they'll recommend that they go to community college for that one term, that one fall semester, take a full load so that when they enter the university in the spring, they come in on track. But those students may take 12 or 15 credits at our institution and then disappear. And we certainly didn't want to include those students in our graduation rate calculation either, since they had no intent of earning the associate degree at our institutions. And then finally, there was a point with these accountability measures if you're going to hold our institutions accountable for the success of our students, it seems to be incumbent on the student to show some effort to persist. So putting all this together, what do we come up with? We decided to define our cohort, define who was a degree-seeking student, by asking and looking to see if they had attempted 18 hours during their first 2 years of enrollment. Basically, did you take 6 classes within 2 years? If you didn't, we would conclude that you're not showing any evidence that you're truly putting in the effort to pursue and earn a degree. So we looked at behavior. We included developmental hours in that count. And we looked at some other states, Florida among others, that used a similar kind of behavioral definition of who is a degree-seeking student, but they used credits earned. They would include students in their cohort for this calculation if they had earned 12 credits or earned 18 credits. We felt that that would be criticized as being biasing our measure towards success, and indeed it would be, wouldn't it? Because you'd only be putting people into your calculation who had demonstrated some level of success. So we decided not to use earned credits, but to use attempted credits. So a student could fail every course and have a 0 GPA and still be in our cohort if they had attempted at least 6 classes within a 2-year period. So that's the kind of key part of the model right from the get-go, is who are we going to include when we do this calculation. And so we defined it by attempting 18 hours within 2 years of when you first enrolled. So what does it look like? Here's a cohort that entered in fall of 2004 as first-time students, includes full-time and part-time students, 25,000. If you look at those who did not attempt 18 hours, you eliminate about 10,000 of them, a larger number than you might expect. So we were left with 15,744 students who had at least attempted 18 hours, had attempted 6 classes within a 2-year period. That's the cohort where we're going to see if they have completed. And when we tracked those 15,744 students, we found that 3,325 of them had in fact graduated with a degree or certificate from the initial community college that they enrolled in. Another 6,590 had transferred with or without graduating. So double counts there. So our graduation rate would be around 21%, our transfer rate around 42%. And what we calculated for our measure was a combined graduation transfer rate. Did they graduate and or transfer? That turned out to be 7,994 of those students, or roughly half, 50.8%. So we cite a graduation transfer rate of 50.8% for this cohort. And so if somebody answers what's your traditional measure of success, defined as graduating or transferring within 4 years, and when you first show up, it's about half. Now, we know from looking at data about our graduates that about 1/3 of our graduates will take more than those 4 years to get their degree. So it suggested to us that perhaps what we need to do is have some interim measure. If we're going to measure their progress after 4 years, we want to have some acknowledgement that these students are making progress and will eventually graduate. So we have some interim measures of success. And also, we had a conversation that led us to assert anyway that students benefit from taking coursework even if they don't complete a degree at our institution. And certainly if they complete a full year of college, 30 credits in good standing with a GPA of 2.0 or above, they certainly have demonstrated that they can succeed in college, and they've done substantial preparation for transfer within this 4-year period. So we came up with another measure, taking that same cohort of 15,744 that started in fall of 2004. There's that half, 50.8%, who had graduated and or transferred. We add to that another 2,638 students who hadn't graduated or transferred, but they had earned 30 credits and were in good standing with a GPA of 2.0 or above. So they basically had completed at least a year of college. And then we added another 877 students who hadn't graduated, hadn't transferred, hadn't earned 30 credits yet, but they were still enrolled. They were still taking classes. We certainly don't want to count them as a failure. They're still enrolled, they're persisting, they're still making their way, albeit at a slower pace. So you add all these things together, and we get what we called our successful persister rate. Now, instead of an 18% success rate, we're talking about 73% after 4 years. And we think it's a valid thing to say, okay, they graduated, they transferred, they've completed a year of college in good standing, or they're still enrolled at our institutions. So another way to kind of look at that is you start with that group that graduated, you add to it the group that hadn't graduated but transferred, not graduating. You add to that the group that had earned 30 credits in good standing. You add to that those who are still enrolled, and that's how you get to that successful persistent rate. And the reason to have a measure like this is because these measures are time-bound. We have students that are just progressing at a slower rate. Most of our students are part-time. Most of our students need developmental education. A lot of our students are employed full-time. A lot of our students have dependent issues, children, parents are taken care of. Financial reasons, they might have to stop out and work and save some money before they come back. Lots of reasons we don't move at that fastest possible time of graduating in 2 years. And if you're going to measure on a time basis, you have to be able to account for those folks that are eventually going to succeed. It just takes them a little longer. Okay. So here is kind of a summary of the couple cohorts that we tracked early on. You can see what a graduation looks like. About a fifth of our students graduate with the AA or certificate within a 4-year period. About 2/5, 40% will transfer. If you combine that graduation and or transfer, about half of our students, and if you look at that successful persistent rate, about 7 out of 10 students will be in that category after 4 years. The next step we added to it at the request of the presidents was to look at these measures by developmental status. So we looked at developmental in 3 ways. We looked at students who came to our institution, took the placement test, and didn't need any developmental, so we called them college-ready students. Then we looked at those students who came to our institutions, were recommended to take at least 1 developmental course, may have been more, and they had completed within that 4-year period all of their developmental coursework that we had recommended. We called them developmental completers. And then we had the third group, developmental non-completers. They needed at least 1 developmental class, but within the study period, they had not completed all the developmental that we recommended to them. So we took these 3 groups, and then we looked at those measures that we just developed. And here's what it looks like. The graduation transfer rate for college-ready students who didn't need any developmental, 63%, 64%. Developmental non-completers, much lower, primarily transfers, 26%. Look at the developmental completers, 56.5%. A graduation transfer rate, pretty close, within a 4-year period to the college-ready students. And then if you look at the successful persistent rate for this cohort, in fact, those developmental completers had a persistence rate even higher than our college-ready students. They're just progressing at a slower pace. Okay, let's summarize all these measures that I talked about. We started off with that SRK rate for my college. The most recent one is around 20%. We looked at that Maryland Higher Ed Commission rate where they combined the graduation and transfer rates. We got it up around 39%. Remember, that does not include people who leave the state of Maryland to transfer because the state systems don't capture that. Degree progress model does capture that. The model we implemented and developed does, in fact, use the National Student Clearinghouse, and we track those students who transfer out of state. So you see a higher rate, 58%. Look at the graduation transfer rate for our college-ready students who did not need any developmental, 82%. A number quite comparable to those 4-year school rates that you see bandied about and that they compare us to all the time. The degree progress successful persistent rate, 75, and the persistence rate for our college-ready students, 93%. These numbers, I think, are much more accurate and certainly reflect on us much better than that number we looked at when we started, that 13.5% that you'll see at the federal website if you look at it. Okay, what are the strengths of this model? Hopefully I've sold it to you already, but I'm going to review the strengths here. The behavioral definition of who a degree-seeking student is. I think that's a strength. We include part-time students. It's the majority of our students. I think they ought to be included in our measures. We include transfers who leave the state. It's about a fourth of them. So if you don't do that, we're seriously underestimating our success. It reports that combined graduation and transfer rate, which I think is critical given the nature of the goals of a lot of our students. And then we break it out by developmental status. These are all things that are real strengths of our model. We include those interim measures of success. We look at those folks who have completed a year of college in good standing. We look at folks who are still enrolled, still persisting. We count them. The Maryland Higher Education Commission accepted our model. If you look at the Performance Accountability Report that we are required to submit by state law every year, it has several measures from our degree progress model in it. So we were quite pleased that they looked at our model and thought well enough of it to embed it in their mandated state accountability report. It's accepted by the analysts at the Department of Legislative Services. If you look at the budget books they prepare when the governor's budget comes out, they cite measures from our Maryland model of degree progress. So it's been accepted at that level. It's put a focus on developmental program completion, because you'll notice it's those developmental non-completers that have the low graduation and transfer rates. That's a good thing. That's where we need to focus our attention, as many of the sessions today did. We now have 7 years of data, a strong data set to look at. We've had some influence on national debates on this whole completion issue. The voluntary framework of accountability being developed by the other AACC. Quite often, if you look at the metrics manual that just came out, you can see a lot of reflection of the Maryland model in there. And the same thing with the Federal Committee on Measures of Student Success, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. And then, of course, we've all used this model on our campus for our own institutional benefit. I know at Carroll we use it in our institutional effectiveness measures that we share with our Board of Trustees. We use it in our program reviews, enrollment management, a lot of ways that we use this model and its measures internally for enrollment management purposes. Very valuable model, very strong model. What are its weaknesses? Well, it's unique to Maryland. And that's a problem, because then we don't have the peer comparisons, the state comparisons, or the national comparisons. And I think that's primarily the reason our governor didn't accept it. Governors like to be able to compare themselves to other states to see where they fall, and I get that. But we have a very strong model, and as you'll see, we're quite pleased with the influence it's having on some of the developing initiatives as part of this whole completion agenda. Everybody's kind of jumped on it now. We've got foundations, institutions, organizations, everyone looking at completion, which is a good thing. I think we all agree that we need to be accountable and we need to look at our measures of success and our students' performance. The only point I think we all make is we want to make sure that those measures are fair and accurate and reflect what's really going on. So as you know, we have joined, the state of Maryland has joined what's known as Complete College America. Certainly the IR people in the room know about CCA after having to do that data collection this past spring. This is an initiative at the national level funded by Carnegie, Ford, Gates, Lumen, and Kellogg, all the big foundations. And the goal basically is to have 6 in 10 adults in the U.S. have a college degree or a credential of value by the year 2020. And their strategy was to work through state governments, particularly through the governors. And they want to see what we can do through state policy change to influence completion rates. Maryland joined this initiative in March of 2010. And as we heard this morning, Governor O'Malley's goal is by 2025, 55% of Marylanders will have an associate's or a bachelor's degree. Well, this is quite a bold initiative in the sense that it will require an additional 20,000 degrees in Maryland annually by 2025. The short-term goal for 2015 is another 6,500 degrees. We went through a collection for the first time this past year, where we were required to supply a whole bunch of data at a great level of detail to the state. There are a lot of positives with this Complete College America initiative. 33 states are on board, so we have a lot of data across the country, and we have those peer comparisons and statewide comparisons that certainly the National Governors Association and others were looking for. So they got pretty good participation for a first round, I thought. If you read their report, Time is the Enemy, there are a lot of good things in it. If you read the narrative introduction to that, they acknowledge and recognize that a lot of students come to our institutions academically underprepared. They acknowledge and recognize that a lot of our students attend part-time and have job and family responsibilities. And so they include short-term measures of retention and credit accumulation. So this is good. CCA, in that regard, has acknowledged a lot of the life circumstances of the students we serve, and has responded by having some of these shorter-term measures. So this part of the CCA collection is fine. What are some of the issues? Well, first, they designate all of our degree-seeking students as degree-seeking students, all of our students that may be in a program. Even if they're in a baccalaureate transfer program, even if they're a spring and mid at the university and have no intent of staying at our institution, they are all included in this calculation. They didn't calculate a combined graduation and transfer rate, which I think is key given the nature of the students that come to our institutions and what their goals are. And they didn't adopt a behavioral definition of who a degree-seeking student is, and so they end up including a lot of non-degree-seeking students in their calculation. A lot of the same weaknesses that we found in the federal IPEDS collection. Another thing they do, this is very sensitive here, they assume that a student who is full-time in their first semester is a full-time student in every semester. And we know from many national studies and state studies as well that this is not the case. Most of the students who start at a community college as a full-time student will switch to part-time attendance. In fact, the studies show that only about a third or less of our students who start full-time remain full-time. So part-time attendance is the norm, even for those who start as full-time students. So when you look at a graduation rate for full-time students, and they measure it after 3 or 4 years, the assumption in those folks who create those measures, and probably in the people reading them, is that the student is full-time all the way through. That's not the case. They turn to part-time status, and therefore their progress towards a degree is much slower. At my institution, 5% of our students take 10 years or more to get their associate's degree. These people are heroes. They're not failures. Remarkable persistence. They should be applauded. Another weakness with the Complete College America submission that we did is the state folks at MHEC calculated some of the measures for us, which I applaud them for wanting to help. But by using their state systems, they exclude all of our transfers who leave the state. And so they missed a fourth of our transfers. So the transfer rate calculations that Complete College America shows undercounts our true level of transfer, and therefore the combined graduation transfer rate that we calculate and that they would calculate is also underestimated by a substantial margin. A fourth of our transfers leave the state, so it's not a small matter if they're not included in these calculations. And another thing that quite often happens, there are comparisons made on these indicators between 2-year schools and 4-year schools. And that is okay as long as you account for the differences in student populations, but of course there's no context provided. So let's look at that issue directly on. How do community college completion rates compare to bachelor's institutions, bachelor's degree completion rates? And of course, I am going to count as a community college completion graduating with the associate degree or transferring to a 4-year school. So completion to me includes transfer. Okay, so if you accept that, then here's what we're going to see. First, let's look at some of those baccalaureate institutions and their graduation rates and see what they look like. I'm going to look at 200% of normal time, which for a bachelor's degree would be 8 years. So these are bachelor's degree graduation rates giving folks 8 years to complete their bachelor's degree. And here's what they look like. This is IPEDS data, readily available. This is the fall 2002 cohort tracked out 8 years. What percentage of their students, native freshmen, earned a bachelor's degree? The point of showing this is not to show that some are higher and some are low specifically by institution. I probably should have blocked out who they were. The point is to show that they vary a lot, that their graduation rates at 4-year schools to look more like our graduation rates. If you look at those graduation rates, these are the same schools in the same order as the prior slide you just looked at. I've just added their SAT profile. Now, there are issues with SATs. There are issues with how they are used in some predictive models. I understand all of that. But just a quick glance at these numbers ought to make the more fundamental point that the level of academic preparation, as measured by an SAT test, certainly is correlated to completion rates at the institution. It matters who your students are. Does it matter at the private schools who tend to be more selective? Sure. Look at the range in graduation rates, 8-year baccalaureate attainment rates at the private schools in Maryland. They're not all 90% either. A lot of variability depending on who they're serving. It matters what your students are like. Same thing, if you look at the SAT profile of these students, compare them, just the eyeball test with the completion rates, the more academically prepared you are, the higher the completion rate of the institution. This shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. But the point is, people don't look at that. So let's look at completion rates at 200% of the time. These are the same rates for some of those institutions you just looked at, and I've inserted the completion rate, graduation or transfer, completion rate of our Maryland community college students. Our completion rate's around 51%. When you compare that to the baccalaureate completion rates at these other institutions, looks pretty good. Looks pretty good. With our open admissions and less selective institutions, our completion rates in context suddenly don't look so bad. And then if you look at the completion rates of community college, college-ready students, our students who don't need developmental education, our completion rate's around 64%, and it looks pretty good. We're in good company. UMBC, Mount St. Mary's, Goucher, Hood, Towson. So our completion rates, if you put them in context and compare them to four-year schools, don't look all that bad, really. All right. Let's look at this another way. How do university freshmen who are similar to community college students in their life circumstances, how do they do in terms of bachelor's degree attainment? So let's look at some bachelor's degree students, freshmen at the four-year schools. And let's look at some risk factors that have been identified by the national literature. The national literature says if you have any of these things, you're at risk of having a lower completion rate. If you delayed college entry by 1 or more years, if you attend part-time, if you're financially independent and paying your own way, if you have children or dependents, if you work full-time, if you're a single parent, or if you're a GED recipient or a high school graduate. Let's look at how these factors relate to native freshmen at four-year schools earning their bachelor's degree. It's pretty cool stuff. Students who don't have any of those risk factors will graduate at a rate of almost 71%. The student you typically think of going to a four-year school. Look at this. If they have just one of those factors, their bachelor's degree attainment rate falls to half, 49%. If they have two or more of those factors, their baccalaureate attainment rate in 6 years is 21%. It's pretty parallel. Look at our students. 63% of Maryland community college students are part-time. 38% are paying their own tuition. 35% work 30 hours or more a week. 28% care for children at home. And on top of all those risk factors that were just accounted for, 63% of our students need developmental education. Bachelor's degree students who have these kind of characteristics graduated at a 21% rate. Our rates don't look so different, do they? It's interesting, if you ask the students themselves, which we do through our CESI survey, Community College Survey of Student Engagement, we ask the students, what issue is likely or very likely to cause you to withdraw from your community college before you get your degree? Number one answer is, I'm going to transfer to a four-year school. Half of them say that. That right there says why you need to have a combined graduation and transfer rate, because half of them are telling you right up the front, I'm going to withdraw from your college because I'm transferring. Look what's next. Lack of finances. We're the low-cost sector, right? Low tuition, cheap. No, almost half our students say a lack of finances may cause them to withdraw from our community college. 37% say they're full-time, and those employment obligations will probably call them, likely or very likely, cause them to withdraw from our institutions. A fourth of our students say caring for independence. And then 20% will admit that they don't have the academic preparation that they probably should in order to succeed. It's remarkable. The data shows it, and our students know it. So much for what Craig says. Let's look at some scholarly literature. American Educational Research Journal, article published just this past June. Authors in the title of the article on the top. They looked at what characteristics are correlated with non-completion in community colleges, and what did they find? Non-traditional status, defined as delaying entry to college, starting college part-time, or having dependents, is the second strongest correlate of non-completion. Verifies the data we just saw from that other study of the baccalaureate institutions. No big surprise. Life gets in the way. This is the second strongest correlate. What do you think the first is? Lack of preparation. Any other guesses? Money, yeah. This is maybe a surprise because it certainly goes contrary to our practice in the state of Maryland. Whoops, this thing is sensitive. For students who enter two-year colleges, financial aid is the single strongest predictor of graduation. By contrast, the amount of aid has significantly smaller impacts on students who go to four-year schools. And yet, where does all our financial aid money go? Variations in the amount of aid received, even in this low-aid sector, low-cost sector, are associated with substantial differences in graduation rates. You want to improve graduation rates, give financial aid to community college students, including part-time students. Here's what they conclude in that article. Here are the interventions. If you want to try to improve completion rates, what do these scholars say? Well, if you want to try to prevent delayed entry to college, you want people to move right on if they can. You want them to take more hours. If you can get them to be full-time, that helps. Of course, in many cases, we advise them not to do that because of their other obligations. But certainly, full-time students do progress through quicker. Give financial aid to community college students. And then reduce students' work hours, which in many cases is impossible because they need to pay their way, they have families, et cetera. Okay. Another question we want to look at. How do community college transfers compare to native university freshmen in bachelor's degree attainment? Why is this important? If I'm going to include transfer as part of our success rate, I'm kind of making an assumption that once they transfer, they do okay at the university. So let's look at some University System of Maryland data. This is data we get from USM, and what they're going to do, they're going to look at bachelor's degree attainment 6 years after entry of their native freshmen, who started in fall of '03, and then they're going to look at the baccalaureate attainment rate of our transfers from Maryland community colleges who transferred in '05. So they're going to give our transfer students 4 years during the BA after they transfer, and they're going to give their native freshmen 6 years. What do the numbers look like? Well, 49% of our transfers will have earned the bachelor's degree versus 62% of their native freshmen. Not bad, but still a little less. But notice what happens if you control for their ability to attend full-time. Community college transfer rate, if you look only at those community college transfers who can attend the university on a full-time basis, their baccalaureate attainment rate jumps to 64%, compared to 67% for those native freshmen. Almost the same. So it really is the ability to consistently attend part-time that accounts for the difference. Again, it's just not Craig looking at Maryland data. I looked at some of the scholarly literature. Article in the Journal of Higher Ed, a recent one here, May, June of this year. The author's on top. They did a fairly sophisticated statistical analysis, and they found that there were no statistical differences in terms of the attainment of number of hours earned or baccalaureate degrees. No difference between our transfer students and their native freshmen. So I think it's fair for us to count transfer as part of our completion measure. They do just as well once they get to the university, when you control for all those things like full-time, part-time, et cetera. All right, almost done. Looking ahead, two evolving national efforts. One is a voluntary one, and then one is some changes to IPEDS, which of course would be mandatory for all of us. The other AAC, American Association of Community Colleges, has the voluntary framework of accountability. The good thing about this is it was developed by community college folks for community colleges. It includes our complete mission. There are efforts to include workforce development, business training, a lot of the other things that we do beyond degree completion. So this is a voluntary effort, VFA. What are the strengths? It's developed by us, so it is a fair representation of our mission, and the measures we have proposed we think are fair ones to measure our success by. Sponsored by AACC, so hopefully when it rolls out, we'll get some participation. Big strength is it includes those workforce development, business training, all the other economic development things that we do on our campuses. We have measures included in the VFA to address that, a big strength. And once it's up and running, there will be a web-based tool where you can go on and do peer comparisons with this data. So a very, very strong initiative by AACC, which is just being rolled out. What are the weaknesses? Well, it's voluntary. So its strength will depend on how many folks are willing to do it. And with all these other things we have to do at the federal level and with Complete College America and all these other reporting things, there may be some colleges that say, we don't have the IR capability of doing all of these kind of redundant systems. So there's a question about that. Is it too late? Complete College America got the National Governors Association, got the governors to come down in 33 states and basically order us to complete these data collections. And so it may be the case that VFA had come out a year ago, and it might have been, had a better chance. And then finally is changes to iPads. And this is actually a good thing. It may diffuse some of the VFA momentum, which is a bad thing, because Voluntary Framework of America has the great strength of including our entire mission, including all the things we do in continuing education, workforce development. iPads is not capturing those, so VFA is a very valuable thing for us to do. But within the context of completion rates, it may diffuse some of the momentum. So what is this momentum I'm talking about at the federal level? There's a Committee on Measures of Student Success. It was authorized by the Higher Ed Act of 2008 to advise the Federal Secretary of Education on better ways to measure completion rates at tier colleges. The assumption is that the recommendations will be adopted and then incorporated into the iPads data collection, which will make them the de facto rates that everyone looks at. So it's very important that we try to get these to reflect as well on our, and as fairly on our measures as possible. Their draft report was just issued in November, and the recommendations that are included are very positive ones from our perspective. They're suggesting we should track part-time students. That's a plus. They're suggesting that we need to clarify who a degree-seeking student is, perhaps by looking at their course-taking patterns, the behavioral definition of degree-seeking, which we certainly advocate. They suggest that the measure should identify those who are college-ready and those who are not college-ready, something we also agree with and do in the Maryland model. They suggest that we need to account for students who are still enrolled or may have transferred laterally to another community college because they're still persisting, another thing that we agree with and account for in the Maryland model. And probably the most important thing is they assert that earning an award and transferring to a four-year institution are equally desired outcomes. A combined unduplicated graduation and transfer rate would present a more complete picture of the success of our students. Very encouraged by this report, and we should probably all be writing letters to the Secretary and others to encourage their adoption of these recommendations. All right, you've been very patient. It's been a long day. You've been here a long time. You've had lunch. It's a Friday afternoon. So I'm going to give you just a couple of takeaways, and then you'll be on your way. What are the takeaways? Measuring degree progress. Enrollment in a community college degree program does not indicate a student is seeking the associate degree, because we have students who are spring admits, people, etc. You know the reasons. Identification of degree seekers should be based on an hours attempted threshold. Look at their behavior to see if they're in fact pursuing a degree. Most community college students that start full-time don't remain full-time. We got to keep that in mind when you look at these calculations. The assumption that they're continuing to go full-time is not a true assumption. Transfers have to be tracked across state lines. In our case in Maryland, a fourth of our transfers leave the state. They need to be accounted for to have an accurate measure. Completion rates for community colleges, as I've urged throughout this talk, should include transfer to four-year colleges. Completion rates are similar at two-year and four-year institutions when you account for their admissions policies and the demographics of their students. And when you say differences in completion rates, when you see those, they're reflecting those differences in academic preparation the ability to consistently attend full-time, and the life circumstances of the student populations. Final takeaway, what do we do to improve completion rates? A lot of the things that Complete College America said, I agree with. You need to reduce the time it takes to earn a degree. Whatever we can do that will do that without impinging on the rigor and integrity of the degree is worth doing, because life does get in the way the longer it takes. Time is the enemy. I don't disagree with the title of their report. Reform developmental education so that students earn as quickly as possible college credits that count. CCA said that. I was in a couple of sessions today, actually, where we were talking about how you can do that, how you can have students take English 101 and Development English at the same time. I think CCBC has a wonderful program doing that. So we certainly agree with that. Restructure programs to whatever extent we can to fit these busy lives. Certainly, that's kind of what we've been about, and it's nice to see others acknowledge that that's what we need to do. Encourage and support full-time attendance, because it is certainly correlated to degree completion, but I added where appropriate, because in many cases, because of those family responsibilities, those work responsibilities, we will be advising students to take fewer classes so they'll succeed. So we can't always push people into full-time, but where appropriate, that will help them complete. And then finally, what the research shows is one thing that we can do, and this is a state policy issue, to help completion rates is to provide more financial aid to community college students. Thank you for your patience. Good evening.